Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third and final video in the BGSU Lunch and Learns video tutorial on Git and GitHub. So you'll see that I have in my browser this website called GitHub. Now GitHub is a place where you can host remote repositories. Now in the first two videos we've been working with what we call local repositories. They are local to your computer, your desktop or your laptop. Now Git is what we call a distributed version control. And all that means is that you have entire copies of your repository in all sorts of different places. GitHub is one of those places where you can push your repository. So let's go ahead, and if you don't have an account, make one now. I am going to sign into mine. Now when you go into GitHub, you'll see your own repositories here in this panel on the right, and you'll see news in these panels on the left. But we want to go ahead and make a new repository. So we're going to call it something like LNL test. Now, GitHub allows you to have free public repositories. You have to pay to have a private repository. We want to go ahead and keep it public for right now, but we do not want to click any of these other settings. We don't want to initialize with a README. We don't want to add any of these extra things right now. So once you type in your name and you choose public, we're going to go ahead and create the repository. And you will see that it gives us some directions. It says that we have an empty repository here on GitHub. Now you notice that we have this URL here, okay? And we have two options that we can choose, and it changes the URL. We can use HTTPS or SSH. These are just two different ways that you can access your remote repository through Git Bash. If you use HTTPS, you have to enter in your username and your password every time. If you use SSH, you generate an SSH key, a public-private key pair that you will put onto your GitHub account. And this means that you can access your remote Git repository without typing your username and password every time. And there are directions on the GitHub website about how to generate this, and I will go ahead and link to those in the description for this video. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and stick with HTTPS. Now, if you have an empty repository, basically you want to make a new repository, you go ahead and follow these directions. So we have this echo command making just a basic README. Everything else we've kind of seen before until that last two lines. So we initialize our Git repository, we add a file to be tracked, we commit it with a commit message, but now we have these last two lines. So a remote in Git is pretty much just a connection to your remote repository. When you create a GitHub repository and then do something called cloning onto your local machine, it automatically creates this origin branch, or this origin remote, excuse me. And by default, we tend to have this master branch, which we saw before. So we have a default origin remote and this master branch. And then we have this command called push. What push does, it says we're going to take code from our local repository and push it out into our remote repository. So let's go ahead and walk through that. However, since we already have a repository we've been using, we're going to go ahead and follow these commands down here. Go ahead and pull up git bash. So we have our code that we've been working with so far. There's our log. Here's our CPP file. And let's type in the command git remote. You see that we have nothing returned. So let's go ahead and add this remote right here. Git remote add, and we're going to call it origin, https ://github.com. Obviously when you do this for yourself, you will not use my username. You will use your own username as well as your own repository name. So we added that remote. Now let's enter git remote again. And now we see that we have one remote listed called origin. And if we want to see the details, let's do -v, which stands for verbose. And we see this URL for both push, which we just talked about, and fetch. What fetch does is it takes code from our remote repository and fetches it to incorporate into our local repository. So now that we have our remote set up, let's go ahead, following this command down here, and push our local code into this remote repository. So we're going to choose the remote origin, and we're going to push our master branch. And there we go. We see that it is successfully pushed 100%. We see that we have the master branch pushed and lined up. Now, let's go ahead, go back to GitHub, and we'll refresh the page. And here we go. We see that we have 3 commits. We click on that. It's the commits that we already had in our log. Let's go back. We have 1 branch. We have 0 releases, 1 contributor, all these extra things that are specific to GitHub. Now there's one thing that I want to mention. It says we only have 1 branch. If we click on this, we see our master branch. Let's go back to Git Bash really quick. We have our hello.cpp file, and if we type in git branch, we see that we have our 2 branches here, master and development. If we wanted to check out our development branch, git status shows that we are on branch development. If we wanted to, we could also push this development branch. So the syntax for this git push command is git push the remote you want to push to, because you can have multiple, and the branch you want to push. So let's go ahead and push development. And let's refresh the page. And you'll see that we now have 2 branches, master and development. If we click on this drop-down menu, we can choose which branch we want to be on. Now, we see a couple extra options that I want to talk about right now. We see this clone command, okay? Let's say that you have a friend that you want to work on a project with. There are a couple things that you can do with that friend. One of them is that you can add them to your project. They will be a contributor. Once you give them access to your repository by adding them to it, they can clone your repository. So you can use HTTPS, or we can use SSH, which we already talked about before. And all cloning does is it says, I want to take this remote repository and pull it down onto my local machine. Now, you heard me mention this command called fetch earlier, where we take our code from a remote repository and pull it down into our local repository. So what's the difference? Clone is when you want to make a brand new repository. Fetch is used when we want to bring down code into an existing repository, when we already have that remote set up. Now, something else that you can do is you can fork a repository. So let's go ahead and look up a repository. Let's look at this repository. So this is Linus Torvalds. He is the inventor of the Linux distribution and also the inventor of Git. So he runs the Linux kernel, and here's actually the code for the Linux kernel. Now let's say you have a really great idea and you want to, make your own version. You can click this button up here called Fork. Now, if you can see it on the screen, I want you to read this hover text. It says, fork your own copy of Torvalds/Linux to your account. So when you fork a repository on GitHub, you make your own copy of all of this existing code, but it's tied to your account. It's separate. So let's go ahead and do that. See how it's making a copy? It is now going to be tied to my account, bladef/Linux, rather than Torvalds/Linux. And when it is done, I'll be able to make whatever changes I want to the code. And while it's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and make a new directory. Because I'm going to show you what cloning actually means. So if you look, I'll type git status. It says that we do not have a Git repository right now. So I could do git init, or I could do a git clone. Here we go. It's still running. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video for a moment until this is done forking. Alright, so now it is finished copying, and I'm going to go ahead and walk you through this clone. So I'm going to use this URL, and I'm still going to use the HTTPS. I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL, come back to git bash, and use the git clone command. So I'm going to use git clone, and then the URL that we got from this little pop-up over here. And what's going to happen is it's going to take all my remote code and bring it down onto my local machine. Now while that's running, we're going to go ahead and keep talking. So not only can you do a fetch, there is a different type of command. So push takes your local code, pushes it to your remote repository. Fetch takes your remote code, brings it down to your local repository, but it is separate. You will then have to manually merge your code from the remote repository into your local code. We have a command called git pull that will try to take your remote code and automatically merge it into your local code. It combines a fetch and a merge. Personally, I tend to use git pull a lot more than I do git fetch. And it's the same kind of syntax. You do git pull the remote you want to pull from and the branch you want to pull down. So git pull origin master. Once you make a repository and you do some work, if it's a repository that you forked, like this Linux repository that we have here, you can do what's called a pull request. And the reason I talked about pulls is because you have this thing called a pull request, and you are basically saying, I've done some work in this project that you started. I want you to take my code and pull it into your project. This is a really cool feature. This is actually how the Linux kernel tends to be made. People will fork it all over the place, that they will make all their own changes. This is how different distributions get made, and they will make additions to the Linux kernel, make this pull request and say, hey, I think these changes are good, incorporate them into the next version of the Linux kernel. And it goes through this big review process. But ultimately what this allows is collaboration. GitHub is one of the main sites for code collaboration, and that's why I wanted to talk about it in this video. So you can store your code in a remote location. So say you have a desktop and a laptop, like I do. I tend to work on my desktop mostly, but when I'm away, I sometimes want to access my code. So I will put it onto GitHub, I will clone it onto my laptop, and I'll do my work there, making sure that I push all of my changes into my remote repository, go back home to my desktop, pull the code down, keep working like nothing changed. If I wanted to, this is not something that I have personally done with the Linux kernel, but if I wanted to make some changes, I would do the same kind of thing. I would fork the repository, make my changes, commit it, and do a pull request. So that's one of the big highlights about GitHub, is it does remote code storage and it allows for easy collaboration. Now, in this video, I want to talk about another website as well that is really similar. BGSU uses this website called GitLab, and it is very similar to GitHub. All the commands are going to be exactly the same. So we're going to go ahead and sign up. For me, I'm going to sign in. I have it tied to my GitHub account because I don't like managing multiple accounts and passwords. So let's go ahead and make a new project. This is the same as making a new repository on GitHub. Now GitLab is nice and that allows you to have private repositories for free. You don't have to pay extra. So what I'm going to do is call it the same thing, LNL test. Now I could import a project from any of these different areas, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just create this remote repository. It's going to be private. I'm going to go ahead and create it. Now, notice that we have the same kind of options that we did in GitHub. You can use HTTPS or SSH for cloning. We have the same kind of directions, so it's showing that this is my username, or my personal name, my email, which is tied with this account. It gives me the same kind of directions for creating a new repository or importing an existing Git repository. We're going to make this a little bit different. So we're going to go ahead and use HTTPS. I'm going to copy it. This is still running, so let's make a new bash session. And let's go into the existing Git code that we've already been using. So we see that we have our hello.cpp file, we have our remote, we have our log, all the stuff we've been using. Let's go ahead and take a look at our remotes in that more verbose context. So we see that just have an origin, or a remote name that we called origin, and a URL. Let's go ahead, add a second remote, and let's call it, we'll call it GitLab. And it's going to be the same URL. Notice that we have a GitLab URL instead of a GitHub. And it would help if I remembered that we were adding this. So let's go ahead and check that our remote was made. We see that we have two remotes. And if we look closely at the URL, we have one pointing to GitHub, one pointing to GitLab. Let's go ahead and follow the same process. Let's go ahead back to the master branch, git push, GitLab, because remember, we can just push to any remote. It doesn't have to be origin. We're going to push to GitLab, and we're going to push the master branch. It's going to ask me for my username and password. And we'll see that it was successful. Let's go ahead and refresh. And we see that we have this code up here on GitLab. So this demonstrates two different things. One, it shows that there are some options to GitHub. BGSU uses this one. So this is a website that I want to make sure that I showed you guys as well. And it shows that we can have multiple places that we push code and pull code from. This is especially good if you have something like a testing server, a development server, and a production server in a more real-world setting. Or if you have a couple different places you want to store code, like, oh, well, I want my code for this project to be here. Like, say you're making an Android app. You want that to be on GitHub. But you have a website and you want that to be on GitLab. You can have all these different places and they can all tie into each other depending on how you want to structure your program. So we've looked at remote repositories, we looked at GitHub, we looked at GitLab, how to clone, how to push, pull, fetch, fork, do pull requests, all sorts of different things. So you now know pretty much all the basics of using Git. There is still a lot more to learn, and I will provide some resources to some more advanced things in the video description if you would like to keep learning. But for now, thank you for watching this video series, and I really hope you've learned a lot, and go ahead and incorporate this into your next project. It's a fantastic tool.